Om, Om. Looks good. Very good. Sorry. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. And starting today, we can recite this prayer together. Chaitanyam sarvagam sarvam sarvabhuta guhashayam yat sarva vishayatitam tasmai sarva vide namaha. Very good. And we'll begin today with verse 15. Before we begin, let's just do, and now we can turn the light on, please. We'll just get the context here. If you remember, we had seen a fairly elaborate introduction of the Purva Paksha, the opposing point of view, by Sri Shankaracharya. And he is addressing this problem called Jnana Karma Samuchaya. It is a non-Vedantic doctrine that says you must combine you must combine action with, and action in particular, Vedic rituals. You must, here karma means specifically Vedic rituals. You must combine those rituals along with this Vedantic knowledge, otherwise the knowledge won't work. And then there are three main reasons why it won't work. One is that action, rituals in particular, are sahakari. They assist knowledge in giving, they assist knowledge in giving you moksha, liberation. And I'm going quickly because we've seen all of this. The second argument is that the rituals are vihita, they're ordained. The same scripture that tells you to pursue knowledge, the same scripture, Vedas, also tells you to do these rituals. How can you take one part of the scriptures and ignore the other? And the third argument is that these rituals are mandated by scripture. Therefore, to fail to perform those rituals, you will incur a sin of omission, and any sin will make the acquisition of knowledge more difficult. Papa karma makes everything in life more difficult. So these are the arguments that have already been partially dealt with. They were introduced by Sri Shankara, and then he has started to deal with them. And Shankara in the coming verses will continue to deal with these issues. And we will see that beginning with verse 15. Virudhatvaratah shakyam, virudhatvaratah shakyam, karma kartum na vidyaya, karma kartum na vidyaya, sahaivam vidusha tasmat, sahaivam vidusha tasmat, karma hyeyam mumukshuna, karma hyeyam mumukshuna. Start in the second line. Karma kartum, to do action, actions in general, and these rituals of the Vedas in particular, na shakyam, you have to go up to the top line. It is not possible to do these actions. It is not possible to do these rituals vidyaya saha, along with knowledge, vidyaya saha, along with knowledge, evam, thus in that way, vidusha, by one who is enlightened. And I'll paraphrase now, by one who has gained knowledge, it is not possible to accompany this pursuit of knowledge. It's not possible to do it along with these rituals. Now this sounds a little obscure. You'll see it clearly in just a moment. Shankara says flat out, it's impossible to do rituals if you're enlightened. I'm paraphrasing. Why is it impossible to do rituals if you're enlightened? If you're enlightened, Shankara would say, you can't do anything. Because, remember, and this is our prior, the discussion in the prior class, because I think half the lights are turned off. Can we turn, I think there's, just noticing the room seems a little dark, and I think only half the lights are on in the front. So in back, that first light switch, all of those switches should be on. There we go. Thank you. Yeah. I thought it was a little bit dark. Okay. So if you remember in our discussion in the prior class, in order to do something, you have to be a doer, an agent of action. I did it. But this knowledge is so powerful, it destroys that sense of being an agent of action. Remember, these teachings lead you to discover that your essential nature is unchanging consciousness. That's who you are, fundamentally unchanging consciousness. And consciousness, as we joked, can't do anything. My guru's joke, it's good for nothing. Consciousness can't do anything. Consciousness didn't come to class tonight. Consciousness isn't teaching right now. Someone came to class. Teaching is going on. But consciousness doesn't do anything. Now, there is a doer of action, a karta is a Sanskrit term, and that karta is associated with his body and mind. So there must, if there's no agent of action, who will come to class? Who will teach? So there is an agent of action, there is a karta, but the question is, are you identified with the karta or not? When you say, I am, how do you fill in the blank? Do you say, I am the individual person who came to class? Or do you say, I am unchanging consciousness? Would I say, I am teaching? Or would I say, I am unchanging consciousness? Teaching takes place. Coming to class takes place. There is an agent, that agent being the ahankara, that mental construct called ego. So there is a sense of agency. There is a doer of action, but we want to be very clear here. That agent of action is not you in an essential way. That agent of action is a natural part of your body and mind. You, in a fundamental sense, are not that agent of action. You are the unchanging consciousness. So, if you are identified with that unchanging consciousness, you have to say, as Sri Krishna says in I think chapter 3 of Bhagavad Gita, na kinchit karomi iti. He says, I don't do anything at all. And he goes on to say, even while walking and talking and eating and sleeping and opening my eyes and closing my eyes. Maybe chapter 4, I forget. You can look it up. The point is, Sri Krishna says, I don't do anything at all, because he's speaking about himself from that fundamental level as unchanging consciousness. So, one who knows oneself to be unchanging consciousness can't do anything at all. What to speak of rituals? That is Shankara's point here. So, Vidusha in the third line. By an enlightened person, na karma kartum, na shakyam karma kartum. It is not possible to do anything at all. It is not possible to do rituals vidyaya saha, in the presence of this knowledge. Together with this knowledge would be a better translation. Together with this knowledge, it's not possible to do rituals. Why? First word, viruddhatvat ataha. Why ataha? Because viruddhatvat, it is opposed. Knowledge is opposed to action. The knowledge that destroys the agent of action is opposed to action. This is Shankara's argument. The knowledge, this knowledge of your true nature as sat-chit-ananda, atma, as pure consciousness, that knowledge removes that identification with the agent. And we'll just say in loose terms, that knowledge destroys agency. And if that knowledge destroys agency, that knowledge is viruddha, opposed to doing any action, and rituals in particular, viruddhatvat, because knowledge is opposed to action. Therefore, action won't help you get enlightened. That's the point. Tasmat, in the third line. Therefore, tasmat, karma heyam. Karmas are to be given up, mumukshuna, by one who seeks liberation. Actions are to be given up. Now, there are several ways of understanding, several levels of understanding that. In Shankara's time, he's really referring to those Vedic rituals. Remember, it was a highly, highly ritualistic time. And if you were a pious brahmana, your whole day would go in doing all these complicated rituals. If your whole day goes in doing these complicated rituals, where is the time and opportunity to study Advaita Vedanta, to meditate, to contemplate? So this is the problem, that excessive focus on rituals, heyam, is to be given up, according to Shankaracharya. Now, that's not terribly relevant for today, since no one does all those complicated rituals anymore. So in a modern context, then we could say that you don't do rituals every day, but most of you go to a job every day. And that's kind of the equivalent. Remember, those rituals were done by those pious brahmanas. That was their job. In fact, for some of them, they were priests, and literally was their job. But even if they weren't priests, they were just doing these rituals. Why? It was through those rituals that they and their families would be blessed, here in this life and in the next life. So these rituals were done for the sake of dharma, artha, and kama, for the sake of worldly enjoyment. Enjoyment in this life, enjoyment in the next life. Now, we won't do those rituals today, but many people go to work for exactly the same reasons. The same reasons that they did all those rituals, dharma, artha, and kama, those are the same reasons most people go to work, dharma, artha, kama, to ensure a nice life for you and your family. Both this life and next life should also be suitable. So there's the same principle at play. So karma, here, Shankara says that karma, in our modern interpretation, your profession, heyam, should be given up. Now, that may not be practical. Remember, Shankara was a monk. Shankara was a sannyasi, and his students were sannyasis. really, it's important to understand the context. Shankaracharya was a sannyasi. His students were sannyasis, so he would tell them, don't do anything. Don't do any kind of work whatsoever. Karma heyam. All kinds of karma should be renounced. Any kind of profession. If Shankara were living today, if Shankara were sitting here, he would say, why are you going to work every day? Because he's a sannyasi. He thinks like a sannyasi. But we can then take one further step and make it more suitable for modern life. And that is, if it may not be dharmic for you to give up your profession, right? You have family and children and others depending on you. It's your responsibility, it's your duty, it's your dharma. To abandon your profession could be adharmic, and Shankara would certainly not encourage that. So a modern interpretation then would be, your profession should not be your main goal in life. We all have a set of priorities. What are your priorities? What is the most important thing? Here he is talking about a mumukshu. A mumukshu is one who seeks liberation. And a mumukshu is one for whom liberation, moksha, gaining enlightenment, is the most important goal of life. There can be other goals as well, but for mumukshu, gaining enlightenment is the number one goal. Everything else in life is number two. Moksha is number one, everything else is number two. That's really the kind of we may have talked about this in early class, a transformation of attitude. Instead of seeking happiness and contentment through worldly means, you seek happiness and contentment through this Vedantic means. Oh, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, and I apologize to our online students. I failed to push the button where it went away. Was it? It was up there before, and it went away? It wasn't there at all. Okay. Yeah, I think it's my mistake. I apologize to our online viewers. This is a verse we've been discussing, and now we're ready to move on to the next verse. Let's continue. But by the way, for all of you, including our online viewers, all of these slides are available on our website, and you may want to print them out, and many people like to make notes on them. You can do that. Anyway, let's continue. Dehad yar havisheshena, dehad yar havisheshena, dehi no grahanam nijam, dehi no grahanam nijam, praninam taravidyotam, praninam taravidyotam, tavat karma vidhi bhavet, tavat karma vidhir bhavet. Starting the second line, dehinaha. Those of you who have studied the Bhagavad Gita, you know these terms very well. Dehi and deha. Deha, body. Dehi, that which abides in the body. Here it comes in the genitive case, dehinaha. For the indweller of the body. Indweller of the body, of course, means Atma. So dehinaha means for the Atma, for the true self. For the true self, grahanam, grasping the true self. Grahanam, grasping, understanding, grasping, literally. Grasping, taking the true self. First line, dehadyaihi avisheshena. As being dehadyahi, as being the body, deha, adi, etc. Taking the dehi as being the deha. Dehi is atma, unchanging consciousness. Deha is this lump of flesh we all possess. So taking the atma, true self, as being the deha, etc., body, mind, senses, etc., avisheshena, identically, inseparably. Taking atma to be identical with the physical body. This is me. And this is ignorance. This is where Vedanta begins, because we all begin our lives being fully identified with the body, mind, and senses. We've been through enough of these teachings. You've understood clearly that you are the consciousness that dwells in the body-mind sense complex. You are the conscious observer of whatever happens in your mind. And as that unchanging consciousness, you are separate. We've gone through all of this before. Anything that you're conscious of is separate from you. Subject and object. You are the knowing subject, definitely separate from any known object. You are the conscious observer. Your body, mind, and senses are the observed. So you understand that now, but previously, dehinaha, atma was grahanam, was taken as being dehadyahi, avisheshena, as being absolutely identical to the body, mind, and senses. This is our superimposition. In fact, I used that term in the prior class, anyonya adhyasa, and I think I need to explain that term. Let me write it up on the board. It is an important term, so we should define it properly. Anyonya adhyasa. Adhyasa means superimposition. Anyonya means mutual. So anyonya, adhyasa, mutual superimposition. And let me explain the meaning of that term a little bit better. Superimposition is when you superimpose I-ness on the body, mind, and senses. You know, if you pinch me, I say, why did you pinch me? Well, you didn't pinch me. You pinched the arm. So if I say, why did you pinch me? I have superimposed my I-ness on the body. I-ness belongs to Atma. I-ness does not belong to the body. But we superimpose I-ness on the body. Superimposition is adhyasa. And notice adhyasa takes place due to ignorance. So we have to say ignorance is the root cause of all these problems. And adhyasa, so to speak, is the child of ignorance. First comes ignorance of your true nature. Due to ignorance of your true nature, you superimpose I-ness that belongs to Atma. You superimpose on the body. And you also superimpose qualities that belong to the body on Atma. If I say, I am male, maleness belongs to the body. If I say I am male, I'm taking an attribute that belongs to the body and superimposing it on Atma. So you see it works both ways. I superimpose I-ness of Atma, gets superimposed on the body, mind, and senses, and all of the problems of the body, mind, and senses get superimposed on Atma, the true self. This is the mutual part of that mutual superimposition. I-ness of Atma superimposed on body, mind, and senses. The problems of the body, mind, and senses superimposed on Atma. And why did I bring all of that up? This is nijam, end of the second line. This is natural. This confusion, this mutual superimposition is nijam. Nijam often means one's own. Commentary says it's swabhavikam, it's natural. We are all born ignorant. No one's born knowing I am sat-chit-ananda Atma. So born ignorant, then ignorance gives rise to adhyasa. Remember, we'll come back to this. We begin with ignorance, then comes superimposition. So, and pranina in the third line, praninam, for all people, this is tad avidya uttam. This mutual superimposition, praninam, for all people, is tat, that is, avidya uttam. Uttam means it arises. It arises due to avidya. Due to avidya, ignorance, comes adhyasa. Let's make this a little technical. Let's make sure this one is crystal clear. Go back to our famous rope-snake metaphor. You superimposed the snake, right? If you knew it was a rope, could you superimpose the snake? No. Superimposition of the snake is preceded by ignorance of the rope. This is the point. First comes ignorance of the rope, then comes superimposition of the snake. Similarly, first comes ignorance of your true nature, then comes superimposition, this mutual superimposition. And let's be very clear that even though ignorance is the root cause, it's superimposition that makes us suffer. When I superimpose the problems of the body on me, so there's a backache, suppose the back aches, then instead of saying the back aches, you say my back aches, I am in pain. This is suffering. So due to superimposition, suffering takes place. And here's our lineage, so to speak, from avidya, ignorance, to adhyasa, superimposition, to suffering. So adhyasa is a result of ignorance, suffering is a result of adhyasa, and it's an interesting point. Ignorance itself doesn't cause suffering. How can we make that point? Ignorance alone doesn't cause suffering, and we know that because in deep sleep, you're ignorant. Any suffering? That's the point. So ignorance in and of itself doesn't cause suffering. But when that ignorance gives rise, in the dark alley, if it were so dark you didn't see the rope at all, if it's just ignorance, you don't see the rope at all, you won't be frightened by the snake. So you see the point. Ignorance is the root problem, but the immediate problem that causes suffering is not ignorance, it is adhyasa, superimposition. Okay, you've understood well. Tavat, and now he wants to come back to our earlier discussion. Tavat, then, at that time, which means during the state of ignorance, when ignorance is present, karma vidhi bhavet. I need to introduce that. And I was going to introduce the whole verse, I forgot. Go back to the board, please, and notice the second argument. And the second argument for jnana karma samuccaya is that the Vedas say you have to do these rituals. Now here's the problem. The Vedas say you have to do these rituals, but this knowledge makes it impossible for you to do rituals. In fact, when you have this knowledge, here's Shankara's reasoning, and the commentator spells it out in step by step by step. When you have this knowledge, there's no agent of action, right? When there is no agent of action, there's no one to be told you have to do rituals. So therefore, the rituals of the Vedas become meaningless. This is the details of the argument. If this knowledge removes the sense of agency is needed to do rituals, therefore this knowledge makes the rituals of the Vedas meaningless. Now you might say, so what? let them be meaningless. We don't care. We don't do these rituals here. And here's the problem. Those rituals are part of the same Vedas that give us this wisdom. Remember, there's a karma kanda and jnana kanda. We had a whole class on that. So the point is if the jnana kanda is shown to be invalid, then how can we say this jnana kanda is valid? If you destroy the validity of the ritualistic part of the Veda, you've destroyed the authoritativeness of the entire scripture, not just part. The whole scripture gets thrown into the wastebasket, as they say. So this is the argument. So go back to the board. This was the second argument, and that is those rituals are ordained, and if you negate their validity, you negate the validity of all of the scriptures, including the scriptures of Vedanta. And in response to that argument, Shankara replies, Tavat, as long as ignorance persists, we have to give a paraphrase here, as long as ignorance persists, karma vidhi bhavet. The mandate, vidhi means mandate. The mandating of these rituals continues as long as you're ignorant. Let me make it clear. The karma kanda of the Vedas is valid and meaningful. All the rituals are valid and meaningful until you get enlightened. Before you're enlightened, they're absolutely valuable and meaningful, especially in ancient times. They're absolutely valuable and meaningful, but not after enlightenment. And this is a rather unique idea, to say that a scripture can be authoritative in one situation, and a same scripture can be not authoritative in another. By the way, you can see how profound the thinking of these great teachers was. So everything we're studying depends on the authoritativeness of the scriptures. For those of you who like Sanskrit, the word authoritativeness is pramanyam. Pramana is a means of knowledge, like the Vedas, the scriptures are pramana, a means of knowledge. Those Vedas possess authoritativeness, pramanyam. And that's a very important topic. Even for us, if the Vedas have no validity, all of this is based on the Vedas. But then now you see the import of this argument. The argument is, hey, wait a minute, all of this knowledge stuff negates the authoritativeness of a portion of the Vedas, karma kanda, rituals. And if you negate one portion of the Vedas, doesn't that necessarily negate the authoritativeness of the entire Veda? Shankara says no. He says that the karma kanda, the rituals of the Vedas, are authoritative when you're not enlightened. When you are enlightened, they cease to be authoritative. And that was a novel idea in Shankara's time. So it was a big deal, and they used to argue very vehemently about all of this stuff. Big debates apparently went on in Shankara's time. And he himself we think he participated in some of these big debates between Shankara and the ritualists. But in modern times, it's not so hard for us to understand. In science, and some of you know a little bit about the history of science, you know that Newton's laws pretty much explained all motion in the entire universe was understood according to Newton's laws. Newton lived about 400 years ago. So according to Newton's laws, we knew how the universe worked until Professor Einstein came along. And Einstein showed that Newton's laws were wrong. Wrong in the sense that they didn't work in certain situations. So Einstein then replaced Newton's laws with a new set of principles that explains time and space and motion in a very different way than Newton did. So here we have Newton's laws being valid until you're an enlightened Einsteinian. How's that? So after understanding Einstein, then Newton is no longer authoritative. So in modern times, we can kind of deal with that, but in Shankara's time, this was radical. So the scriptures, the ritualistic part of the Vedas, are authoritative, absolutely authoritative, until you get enlightened. Okay, continuing. Neti neti ti dehadin, neti neti ti dehadin, apohyatma visheshata, apohyatma visheshitaha, avisheshatma bodhartam, avisheshatma bodhartam, tena vidya nivartita, tena vidya nivartita. So after showing the validity of the karma kanda up until enlightenment, with enlightenment it's no longer authoritative, but the jnana kanda, the teachings of Advaita Vedanta, continue to be authoritative, and that's where our attention is turned now. And Shankara here quotes from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. You may not know this Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, but you certainly know this quotation, neti neti, na iti, na iti. And it describes a process of negation. And that process of negation we've actually used here a number of times. When you recognize yourself as the awareful subject, anything known to you is not you, na iti, not you. So I am the awareful subject. I know the room. It is not me, neti. I am the awareful subject. I know this chair. It is not me, neti. As the awareful subject, I know this physical body. Therefore, it's not me, neti. As an awareful subject, I know the function of my five senses. But therefore, they're not me, neti. As the awareful subject, I know what my mind is doing. I know my thoughts. I know my emotions. My thoughts and emotions are known to me. The activities of my mind are known to me. Anything known to me is not me. Neti, neti. Iti. Thus, dehadin, deha, body, adi, etc. The body, the senses, the mind, the thoughts, the emotions, all of these, apohya, having negated all of these, what remains? Atma avasheshitaha. Atma, the true self, avasheshitaha, remains. You can negate everything, and when you've negated everything, what remains? Obviously, what remains is the essence of the one doing the negation, right? You're doing the negation. The essence of the one engaged in negation remains. The negator cannot be negated. What is different from you can be negated. You can't negate yourself. You are a conscious being. How can you negate that? You are a conscious being. And non-negatable fundamental truth. You are a conscious being. That conscious being is called Atma. Atma avasheshitaha. Atma remains after this process of negation takes place. And all of this is done avishesha atma bodhartam. It is done bodhartam for the sake of knowledge, knowledge of Atma, the true self, Atma being avishesha, unqualified. By the way, for our Sanskrit students, notice prior line, avasheshita, here, avishesha, and they're completely different words. Absolutely different words. Just one letter, one syllable can completely change the meaning of something. So in the prior line, we're talking about that which remains. That which remains is avasheshita. Here we're not talking about what remains. We're talking about that which is, literally that which has no adjectives. In Sanskrit, vishesha or visheshana is an adjective. So here he says, vishesha, Atma which has no, let me just say it, Atma which has no adjectives. And I'm being a little overly literal here, but I think it's helpful. Let me explain. Atma has no adjectives. That's actually a very important thing. Adjectives are words like heavy, fat, short, tall, old, young, agitated, sad. All those adjectives. We have lots of adjectives like that. Adjectives which describe our bodies. Adjectives which describe so our bodies are old, our bodies are fat, our bodies are decaying, our bodies are in pain, so all of painful. All these adjectives belong to the body. Then we have more adjectives for our five senses, like being nearsighted, being hard of hearing. These are adjectives. Notice how all of these adjectives are wrongly superimposed on Atma. So when you say, I am fat, Atma is not fat. His body needs to lose some weight, I admit it. Atma is not fat. Or if I say, I am nearsighted, I'm not consciousness doesn't get nearsighted. Eyes. So these are adjectives which refer to the body, adjectives which describe our five senses, and how many adjectives to describe our minds? Bright, dull, intelligent, unintelligent, happy, sad, agitated, calm. Lots of adjectives. All of these adjectives describe our minds. But due to this problem of adhyasa, all the adjectives which belong to the body, mind, and senses, all of those adjectives are wrongly superimposed on atma. Suppose you remove all of those adjectives. So you have that sentence I've given before, I am, and then fill in the blank. And whatever you fill in the blank will be an adjective, right? I am fat, I am this, I am that, etc. Suppose you can remove all adjectives through this neti. Suppose every last adjective gets negated, so you're left with I am and an empty blank. Excellent. That's a step in the right direction. I am and an empty blank. That empty blank means no adjective. The word here, avishesha. Unconditioned. Atma is unconditioned consciousness, unchanging consciousness. Consciousness that's utterly unaffected by anything and everything. Just to remind you, just like this crystal may appear orange, but it's utterly unaffected by orangeness. You can superimpose, here's the adjective. Orange is an adjective. The adjective orange belongs to the cloth. But then you superimpose the orangeness, the adjective that belongs to the cloth, gets superimposed on the crystal. Suppose we get rid of all these adjectives. We have the clear crystal representing unconditioned consciousness. I am, and don't fill in the blank. I am is who you are. I am is a conscious being. I, consciousness, am, being. I am, you exist as a conscious being with no conditioning, no adjectives. Adjectives, in fact, in Sanskrit, is so fussy about language. So visheshana, an adjective, is that which specifies or limits. So if you specify or limit something, you're making it limited. Suppose you remove all those adjectives, you remove all those specifications, you remove all those limitations. When you remove all limitations, what remains is limitless. I am blank. I, consciousness, am, let me use the Sanskrit words. I, chit, am, sat, blank, limitlessness, ananda, anantya, fullness, completeness, boundarylessness. So that blank represents the absence of limitations. Absence of limitations means boundarylessness, limitlessness, infinitude, fullness, completeness. I am blank. No adjective. Avishesha atma. Atma, which is utterly unconditioned. Tena, by this knowledge, this is the last line. Tena, by this knowledge, avidya nivartita. By this knowledge, ignorance is removed. By the knowledge born of this method, neti, when all And just to summarize the whole verse, when all adjectives are removed, what remains is you in your true nature. Remember, you don't become that. We've had this discussion before. You already are that. That we say that your true nature is divine, that's an already existent fact, which is covered up by ignorance. You don't become divine, but rather your divine nature, your divinity is discovered. So tena, by this process of removing all the adjectives, removing all the superimposition. Through that process of vidya nivartita, ignorance is removed. Now, we have time for the next verse. Now, you might wonder, well, if ignorance gets removed, this is the commentator introduces a verse, how can you be sure it won't return? So many times in life you get rid of a problem and it comes back. It's like you have the problem of hunger. What do? Eat something. Wonderful, problem is over. What happens after several hours? The problem comes right back. Well, could this be the same situation? You can get rid of that hunger, it keeps coming back. It's like these, there's that dal they have in Kerala. It has that round bottom, and that dal on the round, if you push the dal over, it pops right back up, a weighted bottom. Or I think the American metaphor is this, they call whack-a-mole. These critters keep coming up, and you keep whacking them down, they keep coming up. So is ignorance like that dal that keeps popping up? You push it down, it pops up. Or is ignorance like that whack-a-mole, it keeps coming back? We'll see. Shankara addresses that in the next verse. Nivritta sakatam bhuyaha, nivritta sakatam bhuyaha, prasuyeta pramanataha, prasuyeta pramanataha, asatyeva visheshehi, asatyeva visheshehi, pratyagatmani kevale, pratyagatmani kevale. Sa, and sa, the pronoun sa is in the feminine gender because it reaches back to the prior verse. Avidya is in the feminine gender. Sa avidya, that ignorance, nivritta, being negated, being removed. So through neti, you get rid of all the adjectives, and what are you left with? I am, minus all the problems. That's that blank. I am, minus all the problems. Sa avidya, that ignorance, nivritta, when it is removed, katam, how, when it is nivritta, we have to connect the word in the second line, pramanataha, through this pramana. When ignorance is removed through this pramana. What does that mean, through this pramana? Remember, pramana is an authoritative source of knowledge, like Scripture. And the Scripture that neti comes from is Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, is part of the Vedas. So that Scripture, due to that Scripture, pramanataha, because of that Scripture that says neti, sa avidya, that ignorance gets nivritta, it gets negated. Then katam, how, bhuyaha, again, prasuyeta. My translation is actually a little bit weak. How, and it makes sense. How would it arise again? How would that ignorance being destroyed arise again? But this verb, prasuyeta, literally means, how would it give birth? Now that sounds really, what do you mean, ignorance giving birth? You make the connection? Ignorance does give birth to adhyasa. We said that before. Ignorance of the rope gives birth to the snake. Ignorance of your true nature gives birth to the superimposition, I am fat. So here's the point. So if, and the commentator is a little bit, not sarcastic, a little rough. The commentator says, if your wife is dead, how will she give birth? That's what the commentator says. So here, if ignorance is removed, how can superimposition arise? How can ignorance give rise to superimposition once it's been removed? Once your wife is dead, she won't give birth. That's the commentator's metaphor. And that's what Shankara is pointing out here. So once you gain knowledge of the rope, that snake won't come back. Knowing it's a rope, that snake, you look at it, previously you looked at it, you saw a snake. Now you look at it after somebody tells you it's not a snake, it's a rope. You see rope now. In 10 seconds, you see rope. In an hour, you see rope. You get the point. It won't come back. Why? And Shankara wants to make it very clear. He says, where could it come back from? Now remember, we said that with this knowledge, the only thing that remains is you. All the adjectives have been removed. The only thing that's left is you. And so he says, in the last line, pratyagatmani, in one's true inner self, kevale, which is that and that alone, in one's true inner self, avisheshehi, you see this third line end, that word comes again, avisheshe, in the unconditioned inner self. So all adjectives have been negated. All that remains is the unconditioned consciousness, which is your essential nature. And Shankara says, asati. He says, ignorance cannot possibly be present in the unconditioned consciousness that remains. So when you've negated all the adjectives, what remains is unconditioned consciousness. If adhyasa is going to emerge, it means that the ignorance must still remain where? In unconditioned consciousness? If ignorance is there, it's not unconditioned consciousness. We've removed all adjectives, including the adjective ignorant, including the adjective suffering, including the adjective limited. So Shankara's point here is that when all adjectives have been removed, all that remains is your true self. There is no source for that ignorance or the superimposition to re-emerge. All that's left is pure, unconditioned consciousness. Now, before we conclude, there's a question that we should bring up here, and that is, for the vast majority of spiritual seekers, for the vast majority of Vedantins, this seems to be contrary to experience. And let me make that very clear. What Shankara says here, once ignorance is gone, it never comes back. It cannot re-emerge when all that's left is unconditioned consciousness. But in almost every Vedantan's experience, it feels like in one class or at one point in time, you get an insight. And that insight can be really exciting and it really catches your attention. You say, wow, it's true. I am unconditioned consciousness, utterly independent of the body, mind, senses. You can get it so clearly in that moment of insight, and then it seems to go away. That's a common experience. Does that mean that Shankara's comment here is wrong? And we're talking about two different things here. Shankara says, once ignorance is removed, it cannot re-emerge. It just makes perfect sense. It's logic. That which is non-existent, Sri Krishna says in chapter 2, that which doesn't exist can't come into existence. Make sense? The elephant in my hand isn't going to start running around the room because it doesn't exist and it cannot come into existence. So when ignorance has been removed, it doesn't exist. That which doesn't exist cannot become existent. The logic is solid. The problem is our experience. And our experience is much more complicated. Logic is very simple here. Our experience is anything but simple. And it has to do with the fact that after gaining an insight, after gaining this knowledge, our minds are, and I think we've had this discussion in this class, our minds have been so immersed in ignorance for so long, this little insight isn't enough to undo all the wrong habitual thinking in our minds. Modern science explains this so well. Some of you have heard the term of neuroplasticity. Our brains literally get wired. Our brains have been wired with ignorance for how long? I won't ask how old you are. Long time. Now here's the point. That moment of insight that you gain is very powerful. But will that moment of insight instantly undo all those decades of wrong thinking and the mind being wired for ignorance? The point is that we begin with that moment of insight. Thank goodness. We begin with that moment of insight, and then we bring it again and again and again until our minds are freed from all that conditioned thinking, habitual thinking. This is why there's so much emphasis on nididhyasana. Did I tell the lion story in this class? Did I tell you? I did, right? Yes? From previous? Okay. Oh, okay. So I can't make reference to it in this class if I haven't told. And it's a big, long story. We're at the end of the class, so I won't tell it. But the point is that knowledge takes place instantaneously, and ignorance doesn't return. What does return is habitual wrong thinking. It's not that ignorance returns. Habitual wrong thinking overwhelms that moment of insight. So it's all that habitual wrong thinking, decades of wrong thinking that we have to undo. My guru said it's as though you've lived your life being hypnotized, and now we have to become dehypnotized. That is a mental process. Mental processes take time. To undo that wrong wiring takes time. So knowledge is instantaneous, but assimilation takes time. And assimilation is, just to put a positive word on this undoing of all the wrong, habitual wrong thinking. Negatively, you can say we're undoing, removing all the habitual wrong thinking, or to use a positive word, we call it assimilation. So knowledge takes place in an instant. That knowledge destroys ignorance. Ignorance does not reemerge. Wife is dead. She's not going to have children. But even after that momentary insight, that's interesting. Mother's dead. Her children are alive. Remember the metaphor? Mother is a vidya here. We're talking, this is not the mother you want. This is the evil mother. So the mother of ignorance has already given birth to children, which is all this wrong thinking. So even though mother is dead, avidya is gone, this wrong thinking continues, and we have to get rid of all of her children, which means we have to get rid of all that superimposition. How do we do that? Neti. Get rid of all the adjectives. So anyway, that's the idea here. Okay, let's conclude with the prayer. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinaha, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet, asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om tat sat.